Jim Harris always thought he was just another cog in the machine. 35 years old, overweight, underpaid, and with a wife who never quite understood what he did, Jim spent his days in the same dull factory, surrounded by the relentless hum of machinery and the constant drone of the fluorescent lights. The work was monotonous, piece after piece, part after part, all for a company that didn't even bother to remember his name. The only thing that got him through the days was his dream of one day doing something more, something greater, though he never had the courage to act on it. Until that afternoon, Jim had just finished his break when a company drone, the kind that floated silently in the corner of every office, buzzed overhead, a small red light flashing. It paused directly in front of him, then whirred as a voice crackled out from nowhere, "Jim Harris, please report to Human Resources." Immediately. He blinked. He'd heard of people getting called to HR for all sorts of reasons, warnings, reprimands, even termination. But Jim wasn't sure he'd ever been called for anything that important, or, really, for anything at all. "Did I screw up again?" he muttered under his breath, checking his uniform to make sure there weren't any stains or loose threads. The drone hovered in place, waiting. Jim sighed, grabbed his lunch pail, and trudged down the drab hallway toward the HR office. The floors were as sterile as the walls, gray linoleum beneath his boots, and the air smelled faintly of disinfectant. His heart raced a little, the familiar unease of potential consequences gnawing at him. When he reached the HR office, the door slid open with a soft whoosh. Inside, the cold, impersonal room was decorated with a few abstract pieces of art that somehow looked more unsettling than soothing. Behind the desk sat a woman in a sharp gray suit, Janet Miller, the HR director. She looked up at him with a polite smile, but her eyes were calculating. "Mr. Harris," she said, as if she hadn't been reading his file for the last few minutes. "Please, have a seat." Jim sat down on the edge of the chair. What's this about?" Janet tapped a few keys on her terminal and swiveled the screen toward him. "You've been selected for a very special program, Jim. Congratulations." "Program?" Jim blinked, confused. "What do you mean, special program?" "Well, Mr. Harris, as part of the company's initiative to improve worker productivity, we've been exploring new ways to enhance our employees' capabilities." She glanced at him, a tight smile forming on her lips. "And you've been chosen to undergo the augmentation program." Jim stared at her, unsure whether he'd heard her right. "Augmentation," he repeated slowly, like he was trying to piece the word together in his head. "You mean, like, surgery?" She nodded. "Yes, precisely. You'll be fitted with a series of physical enhancements: strength, speed, endurance. A full transformation into a more capable version of yourself." She paused, letting the words settle. "Of course, the benefits are tremendous. You'll be able to outperform your colleagues, handle more difficult tasks with ease, and rise within the company much faster." Jim blinked, trying to process it. He wasn't exactly thrilled with the idea of being augmented, whatever that meant. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't even athletic. I don't understand. Is this mandatory?" Janet's smile didn't fade, but something in her eyes sharpened. "The program is voluntary, of course. However, employees who choose not to participate will face termination. As you can imagine, this is a highly competitive company. We can't afford to keep people around who aren't evolving with the times." Jim felt a cold shiver of dread run through him. He'd heard rumors about people being pushed out of jobs if they weren't able to keep up. It wasn't like he had any better options. He had a family to feed, bills to pay, and honestly, the idea of being stronger, more capable, hell, even just not getting fired, sounded better than sitting on his ass in a factory for the rest of his life. "So, what happens next?" he asked, swallowing hard. "You'll report to our medical center immediately," Janet said. "The procedure will take a few days. After that, you'll be briefed on your new responsibilities." Jim stood, his mind still reeling. But the drone had already reappeared in the doorway, hovering patiently. "Right," he muttered. "I'll go." Where is the medical center?" Janet didn't answer right away. Her smile tightened. "You'll be given all the details when you arrive." The medical center was a sleek, clinical facility, sterile white walls, fluorescent lights overhead, and an air of quiet efficiency that made Jim feel like he was a part of some grand experiment. A nurse greeted him with a polite but emotionless smile, and he was quickly ushered into a sterile room where he was told to strip down and get into a medical gown. "Don't worry," the nurse said as she attached electrodes to his skin and began a series of diagnostic scans. "This process is safe. You'll feel stronger, healthier, and better than ever." Jim didn't respond. He just lay there, feeling a wave of nausea creeping up his throat as the technician worked on him. His mind kept going back to his conversation with Janet. He could understand why they would want to improve workers. Hell, it was an efficient way to get people to work harder, longer, faster. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about this whole process. Before he could dwell on it further, the nurse spoke again. "We're ready for the first step, Mr. Harris. Are you sure you're prepared for the procedure?" "Sure," Jim said, though he wasn't entirely sure of anything. It was too late to back out now. The operation, if you could call it that, wasn't as painful as Jim had feared, but it was far from comfortable. The doctor inserted various devices into his body, needles that seemed to pulse with strange, alien energy, wires snaking beneath his skin. At one point, Jim could feel a cold sensation spreading throughout his body, a numbness that seemed to dull his senses and his emotions. After the procedure, he was placed in a recovery room. The machines around him beeped steadily, and his body felt wrong. Stronger, certainly. He could feel muscles shifting and growing under his skin, his bones aching with the unfamiliar weight of them. But there was a strange hollowness to it, a feeling as if the very essence of his humanity was slipping away. He didn't have long to think about it before he fell into an exhausted sleep. When Jim awoke, the change was immediate and noticeable. His body was different. He stood from the bed, feeling the surge of new strength in his limbs. His reflection in the mirror was startling. He looked like a completely different person. His muscles were more defined, his posture straighter, his movements smoother. But his face? His eyes seemed emptier somehow. A voice echoed in his head, quiet and distant, reminding him that he was here for a reason. A soldier for the company, he thought bitterly. That was what they were making of him, wasn't it? The door slid open, and the nurse entered with a pleasant smile. "Good morning, Mr. Harris. How are you feeling?" "I feel weird," he muttered, still trying to get used to the alien sensations in his body. "Stronger, but it's not the same." The nurse nodded knowingly. "It's normal. The process will take time to adjust to. But don't worry, soon, you'll be fully integrated into the company's workforce. Ready to do your part?" Jim didn't respond. He had no idea what his part would be, but for the first time in his life, he felt like a machine rather than a man. He was about to ask more questions when the door opened again, and another figure entered. This time, it was Janet Miller. "You're looking strong, Mr. Harris," she said, her smile never faltering. Jim stared at her, his mind racing. He had questions, doubts, fears. But most of all, he had a sinking feeling in his gut. Something was wrong with this whole situation. And the more he thought about it, the more certain he became that it wasn't just his body that had been altered. It was his very soul. Jim had no idea what to say to Janet. Her smile was too perfect, her posture too polished. It was as if she had already won, as if the game was over, and he was just a piece on a board he couldn't even begin to understand. He felt that same numbness creeping back into his chest, a cold emptiness that had settled there after the procedure. He should have been excited, happy even. He was stronger now. He could feel it in his limbs, in the way he stood, the way he moved. But that feeling of power, raw and new, was buried beneath something far darker. Janet didn't seem to notice his inner turmoil. She walked around him, making small talk, her voice smooth and polite, like she was trying to sell him a new product, but Jim couldn't keep up with her words. He was too focused on his own body, on the way his heart beat in his chest like a machine's piston, on the way his muscles twitched as if they were waking up for the first time. And his head, it felt light, distant. It was as if his mind wasn't fully tethered to his body. "We're going to take you through some exercises now," Janet continued, snapping Jim's attention back. "You'll need to learn to control your enhanced strength and agility. The company wants to ensure you're fully integrated into your new role." Jim didn't respond. His eyes narrowed, a flicker of rebellion sparking inside him, though it felt far away, like a voice muffled under water. He couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he'd signed away more than just his physical limitations. He had given them access to something far more intimate, his mind, his soul, his very sense of who he was. As they moved through the training exercises, Jim could feel the changes taking hold. His body moved with fluidity he had never known before, a grace he'd never been capable of. Every action felt deliberate, controlled, instinctual. His new physicality was undeniable. He could lift weights that would have crushed him before, jump higher than he ever could. He could feel the power coursing through him, and at the same time, it felt hollow. The exercises were designed to test his limits, to push him to the edge of what he could do. Jim excelled at them, of course. He could feel the adrenaline rushing through him, but somewhere deep down, there was a twinge of doubt. A question he couldn't answer. What was this all for? Was this truly an upgrade, or had he just traded one form of control for another? As the day wore on, he began to notice something else, a strange emptiness settling over him. He was physically perfect, capable of more than he'd ever dreamed, but his emotions felt like they were slipping away, fading into the background. He tried to remember what it was like to laugh, to enjoy something, but the memories felt like they belonged to someone else. It was during one of the breaks, when he was alone in the locker room, that it hit him. He was different. Not just in his body, but in his mind. He wasn't angry anymore. He wasn't scared. It was like the feelings he used to have, his doubts, his frustrations, even his desires, had been wiped away. It wasn't just the physical enhancements. It was something deeper, something more insidious. His gaze fell to his wrist. There, hidden beneath his skin, was the implant. The chip. He'd been told it would be a part of the procedure, but no one had explained what it did, not in detail. He had assumed it was just a way to control the physical enhancements, a tool to regulate the new power surging through his body. But now, standing in the sterile locker room with only his reflection for company, he realized it wasn't just about his strength. It wasn't just about making him a better worker, a better soldier, a more efficient cog in the machine. This was about control. Complete control. The coldness inside him spread. The more he thought about it, the more he felt like a puppet. His emotions had been suppressed, manipulated. The chip wasn't just there to regulate his physical abilities, it was there to ensure he stayed compliant, to keep him in line. He clenched his fists, but there was no anger behind the motion. Just the mechanical, automatic response of a body that had been altered to act without hesitation, without questioning. It was then that he knew. He couldn't stay here. Not like this. Not as some corporate-controlled weapon. He needed to fight back. He didn't know how he would do it, but the desire for freedom, real freedom, began to stir inside him. The voice in his head, the one that had been quiet and distant, started to speak up again, louder now. He wasn't just a tool. He wasn't just an experiment. He was human, and he deserved more than this. But how? How could he fight back when he didn't even know the full extent of what the company had done to him? And how could he trust anyone when he wasn't sure if anyone else even knew what was going on? His mind raced, spinning in circles. He knew there had to be others, workers like him, workers who had been altered, manipulated, turned into something they weren't. If he could find them, maybe together they could find a way to bring this whole thing down. The problem was, how would he find them? How would he know who to trust? He needed answers. He needed to know more about the chip, about the program, about everything the company was doing to turn ordinary people like him into weapons. That he pulled on his uniform and walked back to the training room, trying to ignore the strange detachment that had settled over him. The exercises were supposed to continue, but he wasn't focused on them anymore. His mind was already elsewhere, on the mission he had just given himself. As he entered the room, Janet was there, standing by the door with a clipboard in her hand. She smiled when she saw him. "You're doing well, Mr. Harris," she said, her voice as smooth and polished as ever. "I think you'll be ready for the next phase soon." Jim nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. The hollow feeling in his chest was still there, but now it was mixed with something else, a growing sense of determination. He would find a way out of this. He would tear down the system that had stolen his humanity and take back what was his. It wouldn't be easy, he knew that. But he was already planning. He could see it in his mind, each step, each action, each way to break free. And soon, he would have a team. He wouldn't be alone in this. Later that night, Jim did what he had been told not to. He hacked into the company's internal network. The chip, the one they had placed in his body, might have controlled his emotions, but it hadn't completely taken away his intelligence. And he needed information. He needed to know what was happening to him, and to the others. Hours passed, but finally, after breaking through several layers of security, Jim found the file he had been searching for. It was a high-security document, the kind no one was supposed to see. But there it was, the Biowarfare Augmentation Initiative. The document detailed the company's secret program to create enhanced soldiers. It wasn't just a matter of making workers more productive. The company was building an army of bioweapons, soldiers that would do whatever the company said without question. And the chip wasn't just controlling emotions, it was controlling free will, too. The document was clear: once the augmentation was complete, the worker would no longer be capable of independent thought. Jim's blood ran cold. This wasn't just about physical enhancements. It was about creating an army of obedient soldiers, mindless puppets, each of them a slave to the company's will. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut: the company hadn't just made him stronger. They had made him weaker. They had taken away his choice, his autonomy, his humanity, and now, Jim knew what he had to do. Jim leaned back in his chair, staring at the file on the screen. His hands trembled slightly as the weight of what he had just uncovered settled in. The company wasn't just altering workers for efficiency. They were creating an army. An army of mindless soldiers, each one stripped of its humanity, controlled by a chip that dampened emotions and eliminated free will. And Jim, he was one of them. One of the first. His heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in shallow bursts. He had been so focused on the physical changes, so obsessed with the strength, the speed, the power. But now, the truth was so much darker. He wasn't just a tool in a machine, he was part of a grand scheme, a cog in a monstrous system that didn't care about him. Didn't care about anyone. It was all about control. He had to do something. He had to fight back. But the question was how? How could he, one man, take down a system so vast, so powerful? And how could he do it without getting caught, without being silenced before he even had a chance? He couldn't do it alone. That much he knew. He needed help. He needed to find the others, those like him, those who had been changed, who had been made into weapons and soldiers for a cause they didn't choose. He wasn't sure how many of them were out there, but he was certain there were more. The company couldn't have done this to just a few people. They had to have been expanding the program, turning more and more workers into soldiers, all for a future he didn't want to imagine. The plan was simple. He had to find them, form a rebellion, and take down the company from the inside. He didn't have much time. He wasn't sure how long he could stay undetected, how long he could keep up the facade of being a compliant soldier, but he knew this: he couldn't keep going like this. He couldn't keep living in the dark, mindlessly following orders. His humanity was slipping away with every passing day, and if he didn't act soon, he'd be just another tool, another empty shell. The next morning, Jim woke with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt before. The weight of the decision he had made hung heavy in his chest, but there was something else now, something sharper. It wasn't just anger or fear. It was determination. It was the realization that he could still make a difference. He had the strength. He had the skill. And most importantly, he had the knowledge. The company had underestimated him. They had turned him into a weapon, but they hadn't destroyed his mind. Not yet that he went through the motions of his daily routine, dressing, reporting to the training facility, running through the exercises. But his mind was elsewhere. He was already planning. Every moment in the facility, every minute spent in training, was another opportunity to observe, to gather information, to learn who could be trusted, who might join him when the time came. It was in the break room, a few days later, when he saw the first sign of hope. Maya, a woman who had been part of the program longer than he had, sat alone in the corner, staring blankly at her food. She was one of the first to undergo the enhancements, and Jim had watched her from a distance, noting how she seemed distant, colder than the others. Her eyes had lost that spark of passion she used to have. She had once been one of the most vocal engineers in the company, always pushing for new ideas, new inventions. But now, she barely spoke. She went through the motions like everyone else, a shell of her former self. Jim approached her cautiously, sitting down at the table with his tray. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was heavy, suffocating, but Jim didn't mind. He wasn't sure how to start, but he knew he had to. If he was going to make this work, if he was going to start a rebellion, he needed to find allies. He couldn't do it alone. "You okay?" Jim asked, his voice low, casual. Maya looked up at him, her expression blank. For a second, Jim wondered if she had even heard him. Then she blinked, a small frown forming on her face. "I'm fine," she said softly, her voice distant, almost robotic. But Jim could see something in her eyes. It was faint, but it was there. A flicker of awareness, of consciousness, buried beneath the cold exterior. "Are you sure?" Jim pressed. "You don't seem like yourself." She studied him for a long moment, her gaze shifting, searching his face. "What do you mean?" Jim leaned in a little closer, lowering his voice. "I mean, this isn't you, Maya. I've seen you before. You were different. You had fire. You had passion. And now? Now it's like you're just going through the motions. I know what they did to us. I know about the chips. We're not the people we were before." Her eyes widened slightly, a flicker of recognition crossing her face. For a moment, Jim thought she might pull away, but instead, she leaned in closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know," she said, her words heavy with unspoken pain. "I feel it too. It's like something's missing. Like I'm not me anymore." Jim felt a rush of relief. He wasn't crazy. He wasn't imagining things. Maya was still in there. She hadn't lost everything. And if she hadn't, maybe others hadn't either. He leaned in closer, his voice urgent. "We can do something about it. We can fight back. But we need to stick together. We need to find the others. We need to form a resistance. We can't just keep living like this, not like machines." Maya hesitated for a moment, her eyes darting around the room, scanning the others in the break room, as if checking for someone watching. Finally, she nodded. "I'm in. I don't know how yet, but I'm in. You're right. We have to do something." Jim felt a surge of hope, real hope, for the first time in days. It wasn't much, but it was a start. One ally, one person who understood. They weren't alone. And maybe, just maybe, they could do this. They could fight back against the company, against the system that had turned them into nothing more than tools for a corporate agenda. Over the next few days, Jim and Maya began their quiet campaign. They met in secret, out of sight of the company's watchful eyes. They exchanged information, observed their fellow workers, looking for those who might still have a spark of humanity left inside them. It wasn't easy. Most of the others seemed lost, their eyes dull, their spirits broken. But there were a few. A handful of others who still had the will to fight. Jim knew it wouldn't be enough to take down the company by themselves, but it was a start. Together, they began to plan. They would break into the company's main server room, expose the augmentation program, and broadcast the truth to the world. They would tear down the walls of the company's control. It wouldn't be easy. It would take everything they had. But Jim was done being a pawn. He was done being a soldier in a war that wasn't his to fight, and as the day of the rebellion approached, Jim knew one thing for sure: the company had created a weapon. But they had forgotten one thing. They had forgotten that weapons can turn against their creators.